Were there to be some kind of settlement, let's say that Putin gains all of the oblasts, he gains the 2 oblasts that he fully controls. He gives back Crimea at the extent of taking the 4 oblasts on the mainland, which I don't think he'd do because Crimea is more strategically significant.
It's not a very attractive prospect. It's infuriating for Ukraine because they lost a chunk of their territory, but it's actually not a great outcome for Putin either, so it's unstable. Ukraine is not going to agree to anything unless it has some sort of backing from the West, preferably as a member of NATO.
How do we sort of return from this precipice? It sets a dangerous precedent for Taiwan, obviously, as the main flashpoint, but also people have even compared, what's happening in Venezuela and Guyana a few months ago.
Yeah.
People like, anyone will just use force to get what they want.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. My name is Piotr and this is The Global Gambit. On this show, we like to look at the nexus of geopolitical risk, macro, but also quite a lot of war and strategy, and consider the West's place in this ever-changing multipolar world, as some like to seem to call it. But the Ukrainian war is arguably the most important conflict, the most significant conflict of modern history, at least in many people's minds, since the Second World War. And I have to be honest, I'm going to not do too much of an introduction other than I'm greatly, greatly honoured to be able to interview and speak with someone who is inspiring me during my studies throughout strategy, war and conflict and policy, Sir Lawrence Freedman, who is a British academic historian and author who is, he's sometimes been called the Dean of British Strategic Studies, which I think is very apt. And he is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, arguably one of the most prestigious in the world. Lawrence, it's a very big pleasure to have you. I hope you're managing in the English heat.
Just about.
Just about, yes, I feel you. But I like to sort of warm up with a bit of a sort of light-hearted question, but I want to get straight to the crux, which is you write a very comprehensive thread often on your Substack, which will be in the description of this conversation, about the war in Ukraine. And I just wanted to really understand at the beginning of the conversation about the end. Things seem to be changing a little bit. Zelensky has alluded to the potential that he's more open to negotiations than he was even a quarter, 3 months ago. Where do you see this at the moment? And is an end game possible? Were Trump election the result? Or where do you see this at the moment and going?
I mean, an end game obviously is possible. These things can come quite quickly or they can be delayed and delayed. It requires political decisions, and I think particularly political decision in Moscow. I mean, there's a narrative in the West and elsewhere that says, the trouble is Ukraine won't accept negotiations. There's no negotiations on offer that are at all credible at the moment. Putin's last requirement was that Ukraine not only agrees to hand over to Russia what it holds at the moment through its invasion, but offers them a bit more to complete its take, and then agrees neutrality, and then Putin will think about a ceasefire. Now, you get various rumours and reports and suggestions that may be moderated, and of course you'll hear from Ukrainians and others that they would like the war to be over, which obviously any sane person would, but not on any terms. And given what we know as the consequence of handing over territory to Russia, and just the sheer instability of a conclusion based on the current line of contact, I think something's got to change. And even if Ukraine becomes more amenable to conceding some territory for the sake of peace, and one can imagine ways in which that might happen, or one can imagine other ways to agree and negotiate some sort of negotiated settlement. That's all very interesting, but it doesn't make much difference until something is an offer that's worth taking. And we don't know at the moment what that will be like. Now, I'll move on to Trump. I don't think, again, there's any particular scenario that plays out just because Trump, if he does become president, just because he's become president, though he said he could end the war in a day, I think many people think it's quite as easy as that. But he has a plan, and as reported, it involves putting pressure on Zelensky to come to the table, which isn't that hard in a sense, through doing that because Ukraine is dependent upon the United States for so much of its supplies, but also putting pressure on Putin to agree to something less than what he wants by threatening to raise the stakes, by increasing support to Ukraine if that doesn't happen. So it's actually not so much about the details of a settlement, but about how you might get to the point where both sides are compromising. I wouldn't say it wouldn't work, but neither side has shown great enthusiasm for the compromise that's on offer. And I think it's important to keep in mind that when Putin talks about negotiations, he's largely talking about negotiations with the West. He's shown very little interest in negotiations with Ukraine. He assumes that Ukraine is a puppet of the West. So the road to peace goes through a deal with Washington and possibly through Berlin, Paris, and London. But it doesn't particularly just go through Kyiv by itself.
But precisely on that point, though, I think one of the biggest considerations is that were there to be some kind of settlement, let's say that Putin gets, there's very many variations of scenarios we could go through, right? He gains all of the oblasts. He gains the 2 oblasts that he fully controls. He gives back Crimea at the extent of taking the 4 oblasts on the mainland, which I don't think he'd do because Crimea is more strategically significant. But, there's a lot of ambiguity around sort of were there to be a settlement of some form, what does that mean for the post-war scenario, right? So Ukraine is heavily securitized. Its ascension into NATO and the EU is already being fast-tracked and so on. But the biggest, I think, consideration for many Western analysts is that how can we ensure that this isn't something that Putin is tempted to do again? So surely that settlement needs to be enough that it's a deterrent or enough of what a satisfactory result for Putin that he feels he's got what he wanted. How can we take this guy at face value?
So as far as a settlement goes, the problem for Putin is even if he got all that he could demand, the 4 oblasts plus Crimea, it's not stable. As long as there's a hostile government in Kyiv getting closer to the West, then he's got to worry about defending this very long line of contact. Territory that is already depopulated will be even more depopulated as a result of Russian control. Ruined, battered territory full of unexploded ordnance, requiring a lot in subsidy. It's not a very attractive prospect. It's infuriating for Ukraine because they lost a chunk of their territory, but it's actually not a great outcome for Putin either. So it's unstable. And as you suggest, Ukraine is not going to agree to anything unless it has some sort of backing from the West, preferably as a member of NATO. And that'll be very hard in those circumstances for Putin to accept. So this is why it's not just simply because he's greedy, which he obviously is, but that it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a partial settlement. You can just about make the case for a ceasefire in which Ukraine doesn't concede anything and Russia doesn't concede anything, and both sides pause and regroup and reconstitute. That could happen. But it wouldn't be like Korea in 1953, because the reason that the Korean ceasefires held for so long was because it was based more or less on the starting line. And you could have a ceasefire this time based more or less on the starting line. That would suit Ukraine fine, I guess. But that's not where we are at the moment. So you're then looking at what could change between you're looking at what could change now in order to create different sorts of incentives. One thing, obviously, is a change on who controls what in battle. It's very, the Russians have made some progress recently, but compared with what they're after, it's still relatively small beer. And they just don't have the capacity for large-scale combat offensives, nor for that matter do Ukraine at the moment. It's just very hard to do that. Now, both sides are putting pressure on the other. Ukraine's infrastructure takes a regular battering, and it's wearisome and tiresome, and it could make for a difficult winter, although they are making some strides to rectify things, but Russia can always come back. Meanwhile, Ukraine is making Crimea pretty unlivable for Russian forces. It's pushed the Black Sea Fleet out a bit. It keeps them attacking oil refineries, factories, making weapons, and so on. So it's hitting back in these sorts of ways. But neither of these moves at the moment, nothing on the card, seems likely to bring the other to its knees. So I think, and as I think Ukraine, however miserable it feels and however desperate it can feel at times, doesn't feel it has much choice but to carry on with resistance. You get back to the question of whether Russia really feels all this is worthwhile. You're looking to the effect on the Russian economy. You're looking to the wear and tear on infrastructure. You're looking to the total dependence on China, and somebody saying, "Is this worthwhile?" And I can't predict the point at which those sort of thoughts have a political consequence, but that those thoughts are certainly there. It's just for Putin to give way to those thoughts would mean admitting that the whole thing was a ghastly mistake.
So I want to pivot a little bit in still keeping with the broader theme, but I want to bring in one point which I think is very important, which is what the war has done to sort of the principle of the might is right. Putin seems to have basically brought back the idea that use of hard power, military force, is the best way to get things done. The peace dividend, as we've known since particularly the Cold War, or the end of the Cold War, is over. What precedents does this set? And if Putin is willing to do this and continue to use strategical patience as his way to, or strategic patience to get what he wants, the West's belief that it can rely on sanctions, or that the overall sort of desire of the Russian people will overcome Putin's, long-term military activities. How do we sort of return from this precipice? Because for me, it sets a dangerous precedence for Taiwan, obviously, as the main flashpoint. But also, people have even compared, what's happening in Venezuela and Guyana a few months ago. If you remember, people like, anyone will just use force to get what they want. And because there's no overarching security provider anymore, the US is internalizing, everything's even more unpredictable. How do you see this?
So first, there's no doubt this has been far more costly and difficult for Russia than it ever expected. And it keeps on fighting, not because these were costs that were already built in, but that the costs of losing seem higher, or the costs of giving up. So this is one of the problems with war. Once you start, you add another objective, which is not losing, to the original objectives. So I think if you're looking for a precedent, I don't think anybody would find this an encouraging precedent for the use of force. And one hopes I think my view is the Chinese look at how they do things and force them in a different way. There's a danger of having rather simplistic views about how the Chinese will go about their business, which is not to downplay the risks they pose.
No, certainly.
Secondly, I think if you look at the way that the Russians have gone about their business, not only with Ukraine, but with all their neighbours, this sort of bullying mentality is not new. I mean, it existed before Putin came along on the scene. Now, it didn't always involve armed force, but it obviously has done that as well in the past, but involves cutting off trade, cutting off energy, raising the price of energy. This whole crisis began in 2013 with Russia creating an economic crisis in Ukraine because a very pro-Russian government was still poised to sign an association agreement with the EU. That's how all this wretched business started. So the bullying has always been there. And I think part of the problem is Putin has never been very good at combining it with incentives, or the incentives are pretty crude. So go back to 2013. Once he'd brought the Ukrainian economy down during the course of 2013, he then offers a $10 billion loan to help Ukraine get out of its troubles, which they didn't have much choice but to seem to have much choice but to accept. And but in terms of sort of a general political understanding that you can get a bit of stability and calm by giving your opponent something of what they want, trying to get your interest into alignment. He's not very good at that. And I think that's something that is another precedent. I could see it looking at Israel as well. Israel has had very strong views about how it protects its security, the role of deterrence, and so on. But it's never really developed a good political strategy, at least not for a couple of decades, to go with that. And so I think, to me, that's the lesson: is that sure, there are times when you have to demonstrate that you're prepared to defend your interests, that you care about your interests, that you're ready to make sacrifices and so on. But you've got to have some sort of idea in mind what the outcome can look like, which can produce a long-term stability. Because one thing the use of armed force does is really makes people hate you. And, that it's going to be a long time before Ukrainians look favorably upon Russians, where even after 2014, there were numbers who, sort of understood what was going on, were prepared to sort of make do and find ways of improving relations. That's gone. I mean, Ukrainians are furious with what the Russians have done. So it backfires in the end. There are very few examples of successful conquest against a population that resists. I mean, you can take over somebody else's territory if the people in that territory don't really care who's in charge. But as soon as they really care and resist, as we've found too, you get into problems.
Yeah, indeed. And I think one of the things that I find particularly interesting is, difficult for myself. So I'm, as you could probably tell, my name is of Russian origin, but I was born in Britain. So I have this rather difficult personal experience of, difficulty of knowing where to stand completely. It's certainly not binary. Being on the big picture that I like to be in the sense of understanding things, what is Putin's grand strategic vision? I personally believe that the Russian grand strategy has evolved as Putin's personality has evolved, right? There's a few different analysts out there who talk about the different phases that Putin has as he's gotten older. He's mentally changed, particularly after COVID, the long table, these all illustrations that he's less and less, shall I say, mentally secure and he's more paranoid of certain people. But that also plays out into the foreign policy and grand strategy of Russia. And to your point about China, I think a lot of people see China as the slow-moving, gradualist power versus Putin's Russia, which is more reactive, more reckless, more revanchist. What are your feelings about these sentiments? Do you agree with them?
Well, we spend an awful lot of time trying to read. Yeah, we spend an awful lot of time trying to read Putin's mind. And it's a difficult mind to read. I think there's some sort of rather basic Russian thoughts in all of that, which reflect, I think, some of the problems of the loss of the Soviet Union and a sense of responsibility for Russians, defined quite broadly, largely in terms of what language is spoken. And I think that's resulted in a certain amount of what's going on. I think if you look at the relationship between Ukraine and Russia since 1991, and Russians were shocked that Ukraine voted for independence the way it did, is Russia has been trying to work out how do you get Ukraine into its sphere of influence. That is, I think, the problem with which they start. And it was largely it's still in a Russian sphere of influence, so long as Ukrainian presidents had grown up as part of the nomenclatura in the Soviet Union, knew their way around Moscow, rather naturally looked to Moscow, with whom they had easy trading relations and so on. So I don't think it was necessarily that difficult for Russia, but they just had to give Ukraine a little bit of leeway. And then as soon as you had the Orange Revolution in 2004, I think the atmosphere changed, because at that point they saw Russia saw the danger of contagion of Western liberal ideas into a territory very close to Russia. And you could see that concern growing, the US, the Obama administration's support for those, demonstrating against Putin suddenly taking a new presidential term for himself. I think that's partly when the paranoia began to set in a way that it hadn't been strongly there beforehand, although you can see, going back to the famous 2007 Verkunda address from Putin, that he's already getting pretty cross. So I think it's a combination of a sense of responsibility for Russians wherever they are, an instinct for bullying, and a belief that Russia is strong and a great power. After all, it's nuclear, and therefore other countries should bend to its will. A fear of contagion from Ukraine, and then a complete mismanagement of Ukrainian politics, which is what happened to 2013-14. The pressure that was put on Yanukovych, the way that they encouraged him to deal with Euromaidan rather than try to find a conciliatory way out, and then the annexation of Crimea, the encouragement of separatism in Ukraine, which was, provoked by people with close links with the GUR in Russia. All of these things come together, and I think then you've got the further problem, which is not unusual, of I've called it fanaticism, which doesn't mean madness, but the more frustrated they get, instead of looking for an off-ramp, as people put it, or a way out, you redouble your efforts.
Right.
And I think that's what's happened. I think it happened in September 2022, which is a real turning point in this conflict, when Russia was on the back foot, could have looked for a way out then, but instead Putin dramatically upped the stakes, both with mobilization, with the start of the campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure, and with the new objectives, which required the annexation of the 4 oblasts in addition to Crimea. So it's a pretty strong set of concerns and convictions which leads Putin to the position he is, which is why it's difficult to get him to back down.
I think one of the things that really comes to mind for me is I want to touch upon this a little bit more, which is the tug of war you could arguably say Ukraine represents. It is a country that is a bridge state, buffer state, client state, all these sorts of academic terminologies which have their place. But I think something that a lot of more Russia sympathetic or pro-Putinists or whatever you want to call them, right? They argue that because of what Ukraine represents to Moscow, what it represents to Slavic people, the Russians, it's so much more important to them, and it's mainly of strategical value of the West. And were a more important issue to come up to Washington, the Americans will drop Ukraine and focus, I'm thinking Taiwan and China, right? That the Indo-Pacific is the primary focus of the United States. So how do you feel about this? Do you feel that that's a little bit of a simplistic interpretation between,
well, I mean, it's not much fun being a buffer state. So, at first, it's not much fun being a buffer state because you get buffeted. Secondly, Russia, if it was just a question of whether Ukraine was or was not in Russia's sphere of influence, which is sort of the geopolitical way of looking at it, I don't think people are that bothered, particularly. The fact that Ukrainians, or at least West Ukrainians, were clearly very enthusiastic about a much more westward orientation of their country, and that EU flags were being waved in 2013-14, creates a degree of sympathy. But I think just the fact that this is a country subject to a full-scale invasion, despite all the rationales Russia may provide, that this was clearly against the UN Charter, it's inexcusable in any understanding of international order and international law. It's only because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council that it hasn't been condemned. And I think there's a very natural sympathy. I mean, around the UK, you see Ukrainian flags flying quite regularly. And a lot of Ukrainians now live in UK and other European countries because there is sympathy for them as refugees. So, and the Ukrainians have made the case. Zelensky has been a very effective speaker on behalf of Ukraine. So I think they do care now. And again, Europe has the same problem that Russia has in a different way. Once you've invested so much effort in this, to fail, to say give up, as we have done in other cases, just to give up and say, well, we did our best, but sorry, Ukraine, you're on your own now, I think would be pretty catastrophic. And I think that's the view of most European governments. Even when it looked earlier in the year as if the US Congress had almost given up on Ukraine, it changed its mind. Europeans carried on. And I think that they will carry on in the future. So I think that we've moved beyond a sort of a geopolitical adjustment to something absolutely fundamental going on in the centre of Europe. And that if Russia is allowed to succeed in that, even if you don't think it's going to be followed by moves into Estonia or Poland or whatever, nonetheless, you now have, you would then have them up to the borders and in a pretty bold and brazen mood, and that's going to destabilise European politics for some time to come. And certainly, whatever we're spending on Ukraine now, we'll be spending an awful lot more in the future on defence.
Okay, so I want to continue this conversation arc a little bit more because I think it's important to address the issues that might not be comfortable but are absolutely necessary. And one of these is the Russian perspective, which is about NATO. It is about this idea, and I'm going to quote Hastings Ismay, First Baron Ismay, the ideal, the purpose of NATO was to, quote, keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, right? And do you not think that there's any truth at all to the way that the Russians feel they are being surrounded? Their national security is not being respected. They're not being treated at face value. And NATO is not a good actor. It is a expansionist power that is trying to, or expansionist entity that is trying to, stem and siphon off Russia's ability to be a genuinely influential force around the world, for better or for worse.
Yeah, well, first, Russia managed to show that it could be an influential force around the world quite recently in Syria, and to some extent the Americans connived in that. They certainly didn't try and stop it. Russia's bouncing around in Africa, getting a bit bloodied in the process, but it's not, as far as I can see, being stopped doing that. And within Europe, the last NATO expansion was some time ago. And though it's true the Bucharest summit talked about how at some point Ukraine, Georgia would be members of NATO, it didn't actually do anything about it because that was a compromise. And there's two important things about NATO enlargement. I think is a better way of putting it. First, it was demand-led. I can speak from experience on this. I thought the arrangement of what's called Partnership for Peace in the 1990s was not a bad idea. It allowed you a lot of flexibility. You could have a stronger partnership with some, a lesser partnership with others. But the fact is, it didn't satisfy the Czechs. At that time, the Hungarians, the Poles, whatever. The line was, you betrayed us in the past. How do we know you're not going to betray us in the future? They wanted NATO membership, like Ukraine does now. And given what's happened, you can't really blame them. I mean, it doesn't seem like foolish on their part to have wanted NATO membership, given how Russia has behaved to non-NATO members on its border. So it's important to realize it was demand-led. The next thing, of course, there was the so-called Founding Act. There was an agreement with Russia about consultation, which allowed Russia to turn up at NATO summits, which it did, and to be closely involved in a lot of discussions on the future of NATO. and the future of international security. Russia ended that. NATO didn't end it. I mean, it would have ended by now, I'm sure, given what's happened, but it was Russia that pulled out before. And, he can say, well, you consulted us and you didn't take an awful lot of notice. And that's always a problem when you say you're going to consult. But it certainly was part of the... And anyway, it's not a reason to invade another country. It just isn't. It's a reason to have negotiations. It's a reason to talk. You can express your concern about things. But you don't just invade another country because they might, though it was always unlikely, has been unlikely since 2008, they might be allowed at some point to join NATO. It's not a good reason. And if that's your reason, why didn't you invade Finland and Sweden while you were about it, when you knew that they were going to join NATO? It just doesn't add up. I don't think it's the reason why Russia invaded. I think it plays down the Ukrainian reasons in Putin's thinking. And it sort of says that the poor Russia was goaded into doing something that it would really not have done. I just don't think, if you read Putin's essay for the summer of 2021, it's not about NATO, it's about Ukraine. It's about the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine.